Bauer himself continues to drop truth bombs about Meghan Markle, including the fact that despite her fakery with Harry, she actually hates Africa. Look.
Meghan didn't like Africa. So
Hang on, I thought they got engaged under the African stars.
Exactly. I think that was
under African skies.
She hated the trip to South Africa.
In a glorified tent, Tim.
Yeah, everything is about her. The generosity is only about if I express philanthropic views, how to reflect on me. And I think that's fine for her, except that she's doing it at the expense of our royal family. And that, I think, is unforgivable. And that is why I've taken her on, because I'm a monarchist. I believe the monarchy is critical to Britain's survival. And everything she has done since she inveigled her way into the royal family was warned exactly what was expected of her as the Duchess, the wife of Harry, has been to undermine the very people who gave this third-rate actress credibility and status.
Absolutely. I mean, the cost of living for them is enormous. I mean, the security alone, which they feel they need, must cost between $1.5 and $2 million a year. The upkeep of their home and their staff must cost at least another $2 million. And then there's the rest. So I think that they're running out of money. I mean, I've conservatively put their annual expenditure at $3 million, but for that they'd have to earn $4 or $5 million. And it's you know, they're running out of money because they've run out of people to interest to buy their story.
Of what the insiders, and Variety says they spoke to multiple insiders. The mood in the building is, we're done, says a Netflix insider on the vibe on Meghan and Harry. Their bedside manner has ruffled feathers in meetings, and lackluster ratings for shows have led to doubts that e-commerce is the best way for Netflix to stay in business.
Just when Meghan's path back toward royal relevance appeared to be taking shape, one uncomfortable revelation threatened to change the entire calculation. Tom Bauer wasn't simply questioning whether the comeback could succeed. He was pointing toward another obstacle, one potentially powerful enough to make the palace impossible to ignore. Because a royal comeback is never just about crossing a gate, entering a residence, or appearing beside familiar faces. The monarchy remembers. It ranks. It measures loyalty through precedent, silence, restraint, and trust. After years of distance, public criticism, and competing narratives, Meghan's possible return was already surrounded by questions. Yet curiosity persisted. Every hint of contact, every suggestion of reconciliation, every whisper of a future appearance created the sense that another chapter might still be waiting. Then came the deeper problem Bauer's argument appeared to raise. The real danger was not simply whether Meghan could return. It was what would happen if she did. A private conversation could be arranged. A family meeting could happen. Even a carefully controlled appearance might one day be imaginable. But none of those things automatically restores the status, influence, or symbolic importance Meghan once held as a working royal. That distinction changes everything. For Meghan, a return without recognition could become emotionally complicated. If reconciliation was supposed to prove that the bitterness of the past had finally been overcome, then being welcomed privately while remaining institutionally distant might feel less like restoration and more like limitation. The palace, meanwhile, could see the same arrangement very differently: family contact without reopening questions of official duty, hierarchy, or trust. And that is where the tension becomes sharper. The obstacle may not ultimately be Charles's feelings, William's resistance, Catherine's position, or even the public debate surrounding Meghan. It may be the machinery beneath them all, the unwritten system deciding who carries royal legitimacy, who represents the crown, and who is allowed close without ever truly being brought back inside. That possibility leaves one question hanging over every rumor of reconciliation. If Meghan returned, what exactly would she be returning to? And that question becomes far more dangerous once the difference between being welcomed through a palace door and being restored to royal significance is finally exposed. The most uncomfortable possibility was also the simplest. Meghan could theoretically return to Britain, meet members of the family, attend carefully chosen occasions, and still recover almost none of what had once made royal life powerful. Because inside the monarchy, access and status have never meant exactly the same thing. That distinction could define everything that followed. Private reconciliation is one thing. Institutional restoration is something else entirely. Meghan might be received warmly behind closed doors, included in family conversations, or even welcomed at carefully selected occasions without being restored to patronages, official duties, ceremonial importance, or influence within the royal machine. For the monarchy, such a separation would not necessarily be contradictory. The institution has survived precisely because it can divide personal emotion from public responsibility. A father may forgive. A relative may soften. But the crown still has to consider hierarchy, continuity, reputation, and who is authorized to represent it. That creates a colder reality for any comeback built through family relationships. Meghan could potentially regain contact without regaining position. And emotionally, that might be harder than remaining outside altogether. Returning while no longer standing near the center would make every difference impossible to ignore. A balcony appearance could become a statement. A procession order could trigger days of analysis. A seating arrangement, a separate entrance, a missing photograph, or simply standing several places away from senior royals could instantly be interpreted as proof of either acceptance or rejection. The palace would understand that danger. Every gesture would therefore require calculation. Too much prominence could suggest that old institutional privileges had been restored. Too little could transform a supposed reconciliation into a public humiliation. This is where Bauer's alleged warning becomes more unsettling. Meghan might not be facing an institution determined to exclude her completely. She could be facing something more difficult, an institution willing to reconcile while refusing to rehabilitate her former royal position. And behind that distinction sits another figure, whose importance only grows with time. Charles may still approach parts of the conflict through the emotions of a father. But the monarchy does not remain frozen under one sovereign forever. The future belongs increasingly to William, and his view of trust, representation, and royal responsibility could determine whether a limited return ever becomes anything more. Because even if one generation of the monarchy were prepared to soften the past, Meghan's real problem could lie with the man whose reign would eventually determine what the future remembers. A reconciliation with King Charles could create headlines. A conversation with Harry could create hope. But neither would settle the most consequential question of all. What happens when William becomes the center of royal power? That future, Bauer's argument suggests, may be the obstacle Meghan cannot negotiate around forever. Because the monarchy does not think only in months or news cycles. It thinks in reigns. Charles may still see Harry first as a son, and that personal bond could leave room for private emotion even when institutional limits remain firm. A father can want peace while a king still protects the crown. William's position is different. For him, the conflict is tied directly to the future he is expected to inherit. Every decision involving Meghan would eventually touch the stability of the monarchy he must lead. That could make sentiment far less powerful than risk. A reunion might satisfy the family. But would it strengthen the institution? Would trust survive? Would private conversations remain private? Would another attempt at closeness create fresh uncertainty? Those questions would matter because royal trust is difficult to rebuild once palace figures believe private disagreements may later become public narratives. Even if old wounds softened personally, official involvement requires something colder. confidence that sensitive conversations, internal decisions, and institutional boundaries will remain protected. That leaves Meghan facing a complicated possibility. She could repair relationships with individual royals and still never recover the confidence necessary for a formal role. And unlike a temporary dispute, succession cannot simply be waited out. If William remains cautious, the problem does not disappear with time. It becomes part of the monarchy's future structure. Catherine also changes that calculation. Not because every tension must lead to confrontation, but because William and Catherine increasingly represent the public face of the next royal era. Any Meghan comeback would have to exist alongside that identity, not overshadow it, challenge it, or force the palace into endless comparisons. That is where the emotional reality becomes harder. A return might require accepting that the center of royal gravity has moved. The future would not be arranged around repairing the past. Meghan would have to fit into an order already forming without her. And once that order becomes visible, status stops being an abstract idea. It becomes something measurable in every entrance, every position, every ceremonial moment. And nowhere would that reality become more visible than in the brutal language the monarchy understands better than almost anyone else: rank, precedence, and the silent choreography of who comes first. Royal hierarchy rarely needs an argument. It speaks through doors, chairs, processions, invitations, photographs, jewels, and who enters a room first. And if Meghan returned expecting reconciliation to restore the position she once occupied, the monarchy's oldest language could deliver a far harsher answer without anyone saying a word. That language is precedence. To outsiders, it can look trivial. A place in a procession. A position beside the monarch. The order in which family members arrive. But inside royal life, those details can carry enormous meaning. They reveal who represents the institution, who stands closest to power, and who remains part of the family without standing at the center of the crown. For Meghan, that distinction could become impossible to avoid. Returning as Harry's wife would not automatically mean returning as a senior working royal. The family connection might remain, but the institutional position has changed around her. Catherine is now Princess of Wales. Her place beside William carries a different weight than it did during Meghan's earlier years inside the monarchy. Sophie and Anne also occupy established positions as senior working royals, carrying responsibilities and public duties that reinforce their standing. Meghan would not be stepping back into the structure she left. She would be entering one that has continued to evolve without her. And that is where seemingly minor moments could become explosive. Who walks beside whom? Who accompanies the king? Who enters first? Who stands nearest the center during a major family appearance? Palace planners could treat those questions as routine protocol, but the public would not. Every arrangement could be dissected for signs of favor, rejection, rivalry, or humiliation. That pressure might even force officials to avoid direct comparisons altogether. Meghan could be placed separately, invited to fewer ceremonial moments, or kept outside certain formations simply to prevent controversy. Yet what the palace describes as caution could easily be interpreted by her supporters as deliberate marginalization. There would be no safe interpretation. Greater prominence might cause accusations that the monarchy had rewarded past conflict. Reduced prominence could appear to confirm that Meghan had returned only to be pushed behind others. And once every appearance becomes a referendum on rank, reconciliation itself becomes harder to sustain. Because status inside the monarchy is never communicated by words alone. But hierarchy is not expressed only through titles and positions. Within royal walls, some of the most powerful messages have always been carried silently in diamonds, tiaras, necklaces, and pieces Meghan may never be permitted to touch again. There is one form of royal acceptance that cannot be manufactured through interviews, photographs, or carefully worded statements. For generations, access to significant royal jewels has quietly signaled proximity, trust, and institutional standing. And that creates an extraordinary problem for any comeback built around restoring Meghan's place inside the royal world. Because royal jewelry is never only jewelry. Some pieces are personal. Others are tied to inheritance, ceremony, royal loans, family memory, or the wider collection associated with the crown. Their value is measured in more than diamonds and gold. They can communicate belonging without a speech ever being made. During Meghan's earlier years inside the institution, jewelry could function as part of that silent language. A loaned piece, an inherited object, or something connected to royal tradition carried a message. She was inside the system, trusted enough to participate in its symbolism. But what would happen now? A return to Britain or a family gathering would not automatically answer whether access to those pieces would return with her, and that uncertainty could become painfully visible. Catherine, Camilla, Sophie, or other senior royals might continue appearing in historic jewels linked to state occasions, family continuity, and ceremonial responsibility, while Meghan remained outside that circle. That contrast would be difficult to explain away. The issue becomes even more sensitive when Diana's legacy enters the conversation. Any jewel connected emotionally to Diana carries meaning far beyond its material worth. For William and Harry, those objects can represent memory, inheritance, and personal history. For the public, they are symbols loaded with expectation. So if Meghan were seen wearing something associated with Diana, it could be interpreted as acceptance. If she were not, the absence could be treated as rejection. That leaves the palace trapped. Denying access to major royal pieces could send a clear signal that family reconciliation has not restored institutional trust. But granting that access could suggest exactly the opposite, that Meghan's status had been rehabilitated in ways officials may never have intended. Either choice creates headlines. Either choice invites comparison. Either choice transforms a private decision into a public declaration. And this is where the comeback begins to look less spontaneous and more controlled. Every symbolic detail would have to be weighed before Meghan ever stepped into a major royal setting again. And once every jewel, doorway, photograph, and seating position becomes politically loaded, the comeback stops looking like reconciliation and starts looking like something far more restrictive, a negotiation over rules. What if the real obstacle was never whether Meghan would be allowed back, but what she would have to accept before returning? Behind every possible royal reunion lies an uncomfortable possibility. The palace could demand boundaries so strict that the comeback Meghan imagined would look nothing like the comeback eventually offered. That would turn reconciliation into negotiation. The palace would not need to announce formal conditions for them to shape every step. Confidentiality could become essential. Private conversations might be expected to remain private. Public appearances could be carefully limited. Family contact might be separated from commercial projects, interviews, documentaries, podcasts, memoirs, or any platform capable of turning private tension into public narrative. From the institution's point of view, that would be about control and predictability. After years of competing versions of events, palace officials could become unwilling to risk another cycle in which a private exchange later becomes part of a global discussion. For them, trust would mean silence after the meeting ends. For Meghan, however, the same rules could feel restrictive. Her life outside royal duty has been built around independence, personal choice, and the freedom to shape her own public story. The monarchy operates differently. It depends on coordinated messaging, restraint, and an expectation that individual voices sometimes give way to the needs of the institution. That clash could become the hidden price of re-entry. Even Harry could find himself trapped between those two systems. Renewed closeness with his family might depend on confidence that personal conversations will stay protected. But supporting Meghan's independence could pull him in the opposite direction. What looks like a simple family reunion could suddenly become a test of loyalty, privacy, and control. The emotional dilemma would be brutal. Accepting tighter restrictions might reopen doors, but it could also appear to undo the freedom that leaving royal life was meant to secure. Refusing those restrictions might preserve independence, yet permanently narrow any route back toward institutional acceptance. And once the public begins to suspect that conditions exist, every decision becomes dangerous. Cooperation could be called surrender. Resistance could be called defiance. A quiet visit could be treated as defeat. A refused invitation could be framed as another rupture. That is when private compromise becomes public combat. And that is where the comeback enters its most unpredictable battlefield, because palace rules can be negotiated privately, but public perception cannot be commanded by either side. Even if every private disagreement were somehow resolved, Meghan would still face an audience far larger than the royal family, and far less controllable. One photograph could be declared a triumph. One awkward expression could become humiliation. One distant royal could restart years of conflict before the comeback had truly begun. That is where every carefully negotiated palace compromise could begin to unravel. Supporters would search for signs that Meghan had been vindicated. Critics would look for evidence that nothing had changed. Royal correspondents, commentators, and millions of online viewers would examine every exchange with William, Catherine, Charles, or Camilla as though each gesture carried a secret message. Neutrality would become almost impossible. If Meghan appeared warm, some could call it calculated. If she remained cautious, it could be read as hostility. Confidence might be described as defiance. Silence could be interpreted as anger. Even an ordinary pause or distant conversation might be transformed into proof that reconciliation had failed. The danger for the palace would be equally serious. Harry and Meghan still command enormous global attention, and their presence at a major royal occasion could threaten to overshadow the event itself. A ceremony meant to project unity might instead become dominated by questions about who spoke to Meghan, where she stood, and whether William looked comfortable beside Harry. That possibility could encourage officials to keep Meghan's role deliberately limited. But what the palace sees as protection, Meghan could experience as demotion. Being invited while remaining peripheral might create precisely the humiliation a comeback was supposed to erase. And Harry's reaction would matter enormously. If he believed his wife was being publicly diminished, even a fragile private compromise could collapse under the pressure. This is where Bauer's supposed warning becomes larger than any single disagreement. Trust affects the conditions of a return. Those conditions determine status. Status shapes public optics, and those optics can reopen the very family wounds the reconciliation was meant to close. The result is a chain reaction with no easy escape. Because perhaps the real problem is not that Meghan wants something the monarchy refuses to give, it is that both sides may define comeback in completely different ways. And once that possibility is understood, the entire story changes. Because the final question is no longer whether Meghan can return, but whether she would accept the version of herself the monarchy is prepared to welcome. After all the speculation, the most shocking obstacle may not be William, Catherine, Camilla, the press, or even Tom Bauer's latest warning. It may be something far more personal. Returning could require Meghan to accept less influence, less freedom, and fewer royal privileges than the life she originally walked away from. That is the contradiction at the heart of the entire comeback. Returning is theoretically possible. Restoration is something else. Meghan could reconnect with members of the family, attend selected occasions, and rebuild private relationships without ever recovering the institutional position she once held. And that difference forces a choice between two identities that may no longer fit together easily. Outside royal life, Meghan has built a public identity around independence. Inside the monarchy, authority comes through hierarchy, restraint, and collective discipline. A limited family reconciliation might therefore be the easiest path, because it requires less trust, fewer official responsibilities, and far less symbolic commitment from the palace. But even that could become deeply personal for Harry. Any compromise would place him between the family he was born into and the life he chose with Meghan. If Charles wanted peace, he could encourage contact and soften old tensions. Yet even the king might not be able to guarantee the status, influence, or ceremonial role Meghan would expect from a genuine return. And William remains the long-term reality. A temporary invitation cannot erase succession. A warm exchange cannot settle the future. William's eventual authority means that any comeback built only on present goodwill could still face limits later. That is why the smallest royal privileges suddenly matter again. Status, precedence, access, ceremonial participation. Historic jewels. Each becomes evidence of whether Meghan has truly been restored or merely welcomed as family. And that may be the real meaning behind Bowers' alleged another problem. Meghan might be able to return geographically. She might even return emotionally. But institutionally, the place she left may no longer exist in the form she remembers. The palace would not need to close the door completely. It could leave it partly open, while changing everything beyond it. So the final question becomes painfully simple. Would Meghan accept a smaller, carefully controlled royal presence for the sake of reconciliation, or decide that a return without real status is no comeback at all? Because in the monarchy, exile is not always created by a locked gate. Sometimes the most powerful message is an open door leading to a place that no longer belongs to you, and if Bowers' warning is right, that may be the problem Meghan never expected her comeback to face.